It's now been a few days since Donald Trump's historic victory on Tuesday night. And since Election Day, as you can well imagine, we've had a little bit of time now to digest some exit polling information and learn more about the winning coalition that all came together that put now President-elect Donald Trump on his way to the White House. Well, how did evangelical Christians vote? What were the issues that motivated them? And what do we think about the results of all those abortion enshrining referendums that were on the ballot in 10 different states across the nation? Well, joining me now to discuss this is our weekly Biblical Worldview segment host, David Closson. He's the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview here at FRC. David, thanks for joining me. Always great to have you.
Hey, great to be with you again, Jody.
What a week. Where do we start? Let's start with the big news. How about Election Day results? In terms of Christian voting behavior in particular, what do we know at this point in terms of how evangelical Christians voted?
Yeah, we have a lot of exit polls, Jody, that have come out. Ones that I've seen that seem to be pretty extensive would be CNN as well as the Washington Post. And I actually pulled the statistics. And again, I find all this really interesting, but it's understandable given the way the campaigns kind of unfolded, given the issues that were stressed. So let me just give you the numbers and then we can talk about it, Jody. But as far as the exit polling, when it comes to white evangelicals or those who are born again, 82% cast their ballots for President-elect Trump compared to 17% for Kamala Harris. Those numbers are exactly the same numbers appear in the Washington Post exit polls, which again, tens of thousands of people were polled. What's interesting is those who had no religious affiliation, it's almost the complete mirror opposite of that. 71% with no religious affiliation backed the vice president. And then when it comes just to Protestants at large, Jody, in the CNN exit polls, 63% of Protestants backed the former president, 58% of Roman Catholics. And then when you look at what Harris polled, it was 36% of Protestants kind of writ large and 40% Catholic, which was a major decrease. Joe Biden actually 4 years ago won the Catholic vote. So just to summarize that, Jody, evangelicals in particular, but Protestants at large, as well as Catholics, really overwhelmingly supported Donald Trump in his quest to return to the White House.
Wow. Anything in there that surprises you at all? You mentioned the Catholics. What stands out the most to you?
I think that stood out to me, specifically looking at the religious demographics. What I think was really revealing, actually, was married women versus unmarried women. So this isn't religious demographics, but just looking at it for sex. With married women, Donald Trump received 51% of the vote. Harris received 48%. There was a lot of talk in the lead up to the election on the huge gaps with women supporting Harris and men supporting Trump. But when you actually break it down, Jody, with married women, they supported Donald Trump by a small margin, whereas with unmarried women, it was actually 59% of them supported Harris, only 38% Trump. And Jody, I think that speaks to issues related to transgenderism. If you'll remember, a few weeks ago, the former president, now president-elect, did a town hall with Fox News where this issue of biological boys playing sports against biological women, this was brought up by Harris Faulkner. And she asked the crowd, how many of you are concerned about this issue? And so, and every hand went up. So married women, many of whom have children, not overwhelmingly, but by a majority of them did support Donald Trump. And I think, again, Jody, that speaks to the issues, specifically issues related to family and issues related to this whole transgender moral revolution.
Yeah, these are really interesting numbers. You can start digging into all this and just never come up for air. There's so much interesting information to glean from it all. But what do you think? I guess maybe a 30,000-foot view. What do you think contributed to some of these results, specifically the evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump? What was it that led them to go to him, or was it something that led them away from Vice President Harris.
Yeah, Jody, 8 years ago in 2016, everyone talked about how 81% of white evangelicals supported Donald Trump. And really, a lot of the elites kind of used that number to kind of talk about, the concessions and, really use it to talk about how white evangelicals weren't standing up for Christian values and that they shouldn't have done this. Well, 8 years later, it shows that those attacks on white evangelical Christians, they didn't resonate. They were ignored. The so-called elite were ignored. And I think it's easy to see why. Over the last 4 years with the Biden-Harris administration, we have never seen a presidential administration become so energetic in their support for abortion. And Jody, here at FRC, we've talked lamentably about how the Republican Party over the summer walked back some of their historic support for the life issue. Nonetheless, there was still a clear contrast on this issue. Kamala Harris just weeks ago was asked, is there any concessions that you would make when it comes to abortion, even with religious exemptions? And she said, I can't think of anything. I don't make concessions on a fundamental right. And then even on this issue of transgenderism, I think there was such a clear contrast, Jody, that evangelicals said, we're going to vote our values. And of course, the issues of the economy, immigration, that's not just a concern of evangelicals. All Americans care about those issues. But on the social conservative issues, I don't think there's an election in my lifetime, Jody, where the contrast was so clear. And evangelicals said, we're going to go with Donald Trump because, in large part, I think, because of how extreme Kamala Harris was on issues that we, as Christians, believe are issues the Bible informs how we should think about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and obviously for Christians, they were probably the most important issues were the ones that we're discussing right now. But there were other issues of grave concern, from the border to the economy to the military to crime, all these things added to the abortion issue and the trans issue and all the parental rights and all these kinds of things. It just, it really was a storm that was not going to be overcome by the Democrats. If I can shift gears with you, David, on this abortion issue. All right, let's come back to this issue. There was really a mixed result on the various state referendums, 10 different states. Can kind of give us a quick rundown on how the states voted and what this means from your perspective?
Yeah, like you said, Jody, it was a mixed result of the 10 states that had these abortion referendums. And again, these referendums, Jody, were just extreme. They, basically allowing abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy. But life won in 3 states, in the state of Florida, the state of South Dakota, and in Nebraska. And in the other states, Arizona, Missouri, Colorado, Maryland, Montana, Nevada, and New York, they lost. And unfortunately, Jody, a lot of them lost by really wide margins. In Arizona, 61% of voters voted for allowing abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy. And what's interesting, Jody, these are the same voters, many of whom who voted for Donald Trump, but then they voted to legalize abortion through all 9 months. Even in the state of Florida, thank goodness, that really aggressive pro-abortion amendment failed. But the only reason it failed is because Florida, unlike these other states, has a 60% threshold, which, by the way, Jody, I think that's abundantly wise. You shouldn't be able to amend your constitution easily. But 57% of Floridians voted for this, what was known as Amendment 4. And so it failed, thank goodness. But again, I think this shows us long-term, Jody, let's celebrate the victories in Nebraska and Florida and South Dakota. Folks in those states worked very, very hard, and this is a wonderful blessing from the Lord. But let's not be naive. The challenge facing those of us who are pro-life is immense, and it's going to continue to be so even in the years to come.
Yeah. All right. So give me your sense on why. Why did these amendments pass? I mean, the majority of Americans do not believe in abortion all the way through 9 months. I mean, what is it that moved these people to support these radical things?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors, I think, Jody. Messaging would be one of them, but money was the big one. I pulled this right before we came on air, but in just the presidential election, Jody, in the general election, Democrats spent $150 million on pro-abortion advertising. That was the second issue. Only taxes received more dollars in advertising. In comparison, Jody, so again, Democrats $150 million, Republicans at the presidential level spent $20,000, so just heavily outspent. When it came to the Senate, Democrats spent $202 million on pro-abortion advertising compared to $24 million for Republican Senate candidates. And in the House, it's almost laughable how these numbers, Jody, it's horrifying, but Democrats spent $219 million running pro-abortion advertising, $219 million, compared to Republicans who ran $8.6 million worth of advertising. Realize, Jody, 47% of advertising for House races for the Democrats were on pro-abortion advertising. You add all those numbers up, it's $500 million from the presidential, House, and Senate races on pro-abortion advertising. And almost all of that advertising was deceptive. It was not honest. It was fear-mongering. And so you can do a lot with $500 million. And again, we were outgunned, we were outmanned, and yet we still got wins in those 3 states, which let's be grateful for. But realize, Jody, like I said a moment ago, this issue's not going away, and we're going to have to get better with our messaging, with being more strategic, and helping our fellow Americans see the unborn child as someone who's made in God's image, who has value and dignity.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me how still I'm trying to wrap my brain around. These are the very same people who voted so strongly for Trump, and then they voted for abortion. But as you just described, I guess it was just outspent with deceptive ads that people really, am I accurate here, really didn't fully understand what they were voting for?
I think that probably explains some of it, Jody. But I think just, again, you and I and folks like us are committed pro-life Christians because God's word informs our worldview. We also need to realize, though, there are more Americans that are pro-abortion than I think we would have ever imagined. But since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, a lot of people are kind of showing their true colors. And I think this speaks to the fact that in the weeks, months, and years to come, we have our work cut out for us. So we need to do the hard work of convincing our friends and neighbors to see the humanity of the unborn. So I do think with that being vastly outspent, there's some who probably didn't know what they were voting on. But in the same breath, Jody, I do think there's more Americans that are lean in a pro-abortion direction than maybe we would have cared to admit just a couple years ago.
Yeah, and not just leaning. I mean, leaning in the direction of abortion for any reason, all the way up to the moment of birth. It's stunning. All right, our time's slipping away here, David. Over the last few weeks, we've talked a good bit about just how radical Kamala Harris is on abortion. Well, you recently wrote a piece that is actually out today on the Washington Stand, and you called it Undeserved Mercy. I love that. Undeserved mercy that she was not elected. And you said that in the context of our discussion right here, in the context of abortion. Elaborate a little bit on what you meant there.
Yeah, Jody, I think, what I've noticed over the last couple of days since the election results, that there's, a lot of pastors, a lot of Christians who are, they voted for Trump. They were excited to see him win. But they're, making all these qualifiers. I just want to say to those Christians, it's okay to be grateful. It's okay to acknowledge God's good gift. Again, as Family Research Council doesn't endorse candidates. As an individual American citizen, though, I can say that I'm really excited, Jody, that, Donald Trump won the election and Kamala Harris lost the election. And why is that? Kamala Harris ran on the most pro-abortion platform we've ever seen. Had she been in the White House, Planned Parenthood would have had their strongest ally in the Oval Office ever. And again, I think the Lord, in his kindness and his providence, has granted us a reprieve. You're not going to have HHS or the DOJ or the Department of Defense cramming down these radical pro-abortion policies on all Americans. And I think this is a time for us to be grateful. Again, as Christians, we have a perspective, Jody. We realize none of our wins are permanent, and also none of our losses are ever permanent. Part of a biblical worldview is it gives us perspective. But I think it's okay for Christians to realize this is an undeserved mercy. We don't deserve godly leaders. And we're not going to endorse everything Donald Trump says and does. But we can recognize we're going to, as pro-lifers, we will likely get a reprieve from what we've experienced over the last 4 years. And we should be grateful for that, Jody.
Absolutely. And this is, I look at it as really even more than a reprieve. It's like a window of mercy and grace that God has given us, and one that we must humbly respond to appropriately and steward it properly. This is the time for the church and believers to step up and get engaged and not just sit back and say, oh, it's going to be good for 4 years. Let's just go about our business. No, we're still in a very serious battle. David Closson, Director of FRC's Center for Biblical Worldview, thank you so much, as always, for joining me for this Biblical Worldview segment on Friday afternoons. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jody. God bless.